you can almost think of political ideology as a prism through which authoritarianism manifests.
Welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley. I've got Adam Daniels joining me today.
Hello.
And special guest, we have Tom Costello. Tom is a PhD candidate at Emory University. His website is thcostello.com, and we'll include that in the show description. We've got Tom on to discuss one paper in particular, but also the general themes of his work, authoritarianism. This paper is, he's co-author on this paper with several others. It's called Clarifying the Structure and Nature of Left-Wing Authoritarianism. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So first, I just want to welcome you to the show, Tom, and ask you if there's anything you want to just say off the bat.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so that paper and authoritarianism in general as like an area of study, I think, are very interesting because not only of like how relevant they are to today's politics, but because it's something that has it's authoritarianism is very multifaceted and complex, and because of that, the way that it looks on the left and right may tell us a lot about the nature of the construct in general. And so one reason I think that the left-wing authoritarianism paper is important is because no one's really looked at it very closely before. It's this like really fruitful area that I think can tell us a lot about politics in general, not just like left or right or anything like
that. In the paper, I think you guys mentioned that, I'll probably have the numbers wrong, but you did a Google Scholar search and found that there's something like, I've got it here, 12,700 results for right-wing authoritarianism. And at the time that you did this search prior to writing this paper, there were 635 results for left-wing authoritarianism.
Since the difference will not have changed. And so I mean that's pretty stark. It's something that is surprising to people outside of psychology, because obviously there have been authoritarian regimes with like at least nominally left-wing politics. Economic, certainly, and like to a lesser extent, socially on the left too. So the fact that psychological science has sort of claimed to have identified authoritarianism as like this underlying psychological disposition that then doesn't extend to people with left-wing beliefs is sort of implausible, at least.
And you point out, you give a bit of history in the first part of the paper on the history of the study of the concept and the construct of authoritarianism, going back to the 30s with the psychoanalysts and like Frankfurt School guys like Theodor Adorno and the F scale, which I think that was such a funny name, especially given the current language. But how that was their authoritarian personality. That was the book they published, right, in 1950.
Yes.
And since then we've had like RWA's right-wing authoritarianism that was brought in by Bob Altemeyer up at University of Manitoba, I think. And you quote some stuff from his writings where he's basically saying, oh yeah, well, maybe we would have written about left-wing authoritarianism, but it just doesn't really exist, right?
Yes.
So
go ahead.
No, so there's not only there's not only a tendency not to look at it, but a tendency to deny that there's anything to look at in the first place. It's like, oh, there used to be some left-wing authoritarianisms, but they're just not around anymore. Well, I mean, maybe there's something to that. Maybe when Altemeyer was writing that, there was like a lull in like extremist leftist activity. I don't know, but
I mean, I think so. Altemeyer was a brilliant guy, as was Adorno. But I think that the arc of this research literature and the reason no one's really studied the left is very telling about how important the decisions that scientists make are, like in terms of what they choose to study, are in creating bodies of knowledge. So just to like give you a little context, right? Adorno, the F scale has these 9 different components, and they're really pretty like heterogeneous and different. They include things like, in addition to like submission to authority and aggression towards outsiders, they include things like fear of like sex and like conspiracy theories and like thinking in certain ways. Lots of very different things that aren't necessarily correlated with each other in most people. And so to be able to put a total score on that is very difficult, because these things aren't related to each other. So you can't just add up the items, but that's what people did. And so the F scale doesn't work because of that. And what Altemeyer did was he looked at that and he said, okay, well, we need to fix this. And he chopped off the parts of Adorno's conceptualization that weren't correlated with each other. And it was a much narrower conceptualization after that. And he, in doing that, tried to like resolve, because there had been this ongoing debate about the extent to which authoritarianism existed in the left and right. And in doing that, Altemeyer said, okay, well, so we're going to make this something that is indicative of conservatives, kind of make them interchangeable. And so defined authoritarianism as right-wing authoritarianism in many respects. And then from there, the measure really took off and people started using it. And there are all these studies about here's what's correlated with right-wing authoritarianism. Here's where if you manipulate this, you get that with right-wing authoritarianism, because the measure is there and the conceptualization suggests that it's on the right. Whereas you could have just as easily chopped off different components, called that left-wing authoritarianism, and the opposite thing would have happened maybe. I mean, maybe not, but I think a lot of this like dearth of work on left-wing authoritarianism is just because of what researchers wanted to study at the time.
Yeah.
And
I guess this is just, I'm totally guessing here, that I've heard various off-the-cuff estimates that most scholars in these areas tend to be liberals or more on the left, side of the spectrum. So it would be natural that if they're thinking about authoritarianism, something bad, Nazis, who supports Nazis, probably that's going to influence how they set up their scale to begin with.
Yeah, and you'd hope that scientists wouldn't do that, but scientists are human beings, and one of the things that psychology has told us is that we're often very sort of irrational and biased in how we think things, approach things, even when we don't think we're being irrational and biased. And so, yeah, you're totally right. I mean, the estimates are like something like well over 9 in 10 psychologists have left-wing beliefs, and a far greater proportion of that of the normal population like it's not just like, oh, I'm a centrist liberal, it's like pretty far left beliefs. So it makes sense that this thing has happened with the study of authoritarianism. That being said, it's been very fruitful. Like there's been lots of really important discoveries made using the right-wing authoritarianism measures. So it's not like the end of the world, but I do think it is a pretty big blind spot, like the lack of left-wing authoritarianism. And so that's one thing I was trying to do with the paper, was like correct the blind spot. Yeah.
Well, that leads me to ask this: given that something like 9 out of 10 plus people in the field tend to have like leftist an leftist orientation, how did you fit into that? Like, and what has the response been? So, like, do you get dirty looks when you're walking down the halls at the school, or I guess it's Zoom meetings nowadays? But how do you situate yourself in that climate?
Well, so we'll see. Now that the paper is out, that maybe I'll get some dirty looks at conferences, going forward. I know that though, but for the most part, people have been very thoughtful and open in thinking about the paper. I think it's something that for the psychological scientists at least makes sense, and has been kind of like a, oh yeah, why has no one done this yet sort of response. For the broader public though, I've definitely gotten some like, you shouldn't have done this study. It's going to be used by racists to like justify their beliefs, that sort of thing. So I've definitely gotten some negative responses. I find that when I explain the work, people understand, but if just like seeing it on its face, that's when folks tend to get angry.
Yeah. Well, and I guess it's kind of a reflection of the polarization going on too, because when you could switch that around too, and with right-wing authoritarianism. So when you see some claims about right-wing authoritarianism, you'll get conservatives who will say, "Oh, well, you're just lumping us all in as right-wing as authoritarians," and actually that might be what, to a large degree, what the scale actually does. But just seeing that, it's like right-wing authoritarianism is right-wing, and when you see left-wing authoritarianism, it's like, oh, well, you're saying that because I'm left-wing, I'm also authoritarianism. But really, like you said, when you actually get into it, that no, there's authoritarianism like as a subset of liberals and a subset of conservatives, and they happen to have a lot in common with each other.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was the question we were setting out to answer, was like, obviously this exists because we've seen it in the real world. So it's sort of a moot point to ask if it exists. Now the opponents of left-wing authoritarianism might say, like, yes, it exists in practice, but that doesn't mean that people on the left are psychologically disposed to authoritarianism. Yeah. It's like, in those contexts, communism was the tradition, the status quo. So the authoritarians were just adhering to the system that they knew. Like, so like you might say that like Stalinists were right-wing authoritarians by that definition. Now, I think that argument has some problems, but there are people who would argue that left-wing authoritarianism as a psychological phenomenon doesn't exist, even though we've seen left-wing regimes that are authoritarian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to get, or did you have something else to say about that? Yeah, because that's one of the things I wanted to get into on this program, because, well, the paper is like, you can read it online. I believe it's on like what is it, SciArchive or something like that, right? Like a preprint site for now.
A preprint posted on SciArchive. The typeset, published version should be online soon. Okay. And that will be behind a paywall. So the way that you'll probably get it is the SciArchive.
Okay. Version. So for any listeners or viewers that check it out, it's a long paper, 47 pages in the preprint, and it's quite an elaborate study. It includes a series of studies that you did, basically like 6 iterations kind of, and analyzing different things and refining as you go. So it goes through all of them, and there's a lot of just interesting tidbits at each stage at each phase of the experiment of the paper. But then some of the most interesting things for like a layman like me are in the introduction and the conclusion, even though there's a lot of good stuff in the middle. And one of the final things that you talk about is this question of, what is this exactly? Well, I want to get a bit later on, I want to get into some specifics about left-wing and right-wing, what the similarities are and what the differences are. But maybe first, I want to talk about this, where you're asking the question, what is authoritarianism really? Like, is there an underlying authoritarianism that just can show up as left-wing or right-wing, depending on some other variable that will determine like the specific ideology of like any given individual or any given authoritarian individual? Or is there actually a difference between left-wing authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarianism? And you basically, you can't mesh them together. There's something fundamentally different about them. And this is an open question at this point, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe can you get into that a bit, and maybe where do you lean? Do you have
in your paper, you actually bring all of these different variables up and say that, well, we don't really know if it is this, and we don't really know if it is that. So when I read that, I was like, oh man, I'd never even thought about that conceptualization as being possibly true, that maybe there's this authoritarian seed or kernel that has its own manifestations in one or the other, or these are two possibly totally distinct phenomena. So yeah, like that was one thing that I was wanting to ask as well, was, where do you lean? You can't say definitively, or at least that's what you said in your paper, but you might have. Yeah. What's your hunch?
Yeah. Well, right. So the headline is that we don't know, my hunch is that there's probably a shared psychological core that is then socialized in different ways towards the left or the right. So I kind of see authoritarianism as you can almost think of political ideology as a prism through which authoritarianism manifests. So like it's going to color the way that like left versus right wing authoritarians act, but the basic disposition, the authoritarianism, is the same. That is what I think is going on, but I don't have enough data to say that with confidence. It's also possible that it's a situation almost like, I think I use this term in the paper, convergent evolution, where like, so you get mammals that swim and have fins that look very much like the fins of fish. And these are things that evolved via separate branches, but ended up looking very, very similar and doing similar things. And so it could be like that psychologically something similar has occurred to that, where right-wing authoritarians, left-wing authoritarians are both authoritarian, but they've followed different paths to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because in that section you talk about, you simplify it to the point of, to a very simple formulation that left-wing authoritarians oppose the system in power, and right-wing authoritarians support the system in power. So, and that perhaps they do so for different reasons. And you give the example of communism and fascism, and how with communism there are explicitly humanitarian goals and objectives, and even you could say anti. It's almost like institutionalized anti-authoritarianism. When you look at communist ideology, there's a very anti-authoritarian streak to it. I mean, that's what Marx was all about. And then, but when you look at fascism, it's like explicitly authoritarianism, or explicitly authoritarian. So you have what could be these two different motivations. But on the other hand, you also have this overlap, like you're saying. I'm wondering if it's a bit of both. So kind of like a Venn diagram where there is this overlap, but on the outer edges, there's something else going on. Because
I think that's likely. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. Totally. So there's this quote from Stalin where he's like, we need to I think it was, it was pre the revolution and everything. He was like, we need to overthrow the government, but in order to have a great, regime consistent with Marxist principles, we need to be authoritarians, and we need to tamp down dissent after we've risen to power. I forget exactly what it is. I'd have to double check. But that sentiment is very complicated, actually. Like that's a complex idea in a way that like will to power, like might is right, sort of far right fascist type things don't incorporate necessarily. Yeah. And complex thinking has long been thought to be like a key component of authoritarianism, at least right-wing authoritarianism. And we did find that both left and right-wing authoritarians were more dogmatic and rigid and less complex thinkers than other people. But we also found that the effect was stronger for right-wing authoritarians. So that may be one difference.
Which was stronger? Which was stronger for right-wing authoritarianism?
Right-wing
or the dogmatism?
Well, so it's a little complicated, because I think that the measures that we use to measure dogmatism are are designed such that there are differences between liberals and conservatives and how they respond. So I think this may just be a function of like some bias in the measure, but we found that right-wing authoritarians were more dogmatic and rigid than left-wing authoritarians.
Okay. One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this, I was recently reading something, and I was just had a section on the Hungarian Revolution, 1956, and the comment was made that a lot of the people either participating in the revolution against the communist government were ex-communists. And so, because one of the, maybe I'll just read it. There's a question that you ask, and I think it was phrased pretty well. So I'm going to see if I can just read that if I can find it. So despite left-wing authoritarians and right-wing, or left-wing authoritarianisms and right-wing authoritarianisms, or no, I was right the first time. LWAs and RWAs marked similarities, it remains to be seen whether left-wing authoritarians who successfully overthrow the establishment tend to turn around and defend the new status quo, thereby mirroring the right-wing authoritarians who came before them.
Right.
So basically the question, and I'd written down in this printout that I have of the paper, I'd written down that question earlier. It's like, so if left-wing authoritarians have their revolution, do they become right-wing authoritarians? And so I was thinking about this in terms of individuals. Like, so let's say you have a left-wing revolutionary whose revolutionary movement gains power, and they support it. Will they then be classified as a right-wing authoritarian simply by virtue of them
becoming establishment?
Yeah. Which it seems weird, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, I mean, Hannah Arendt, the wonderful philosopher, has this quote: "The most radical revolutionary becomes a conservative the day after the revolution." I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think that that is one thing. Studying this would be a great way of getting at the question of whether there's a shared core or how much does that Venn diagram overlap. That would be the thing you do to really answer that question. The problem is, how do you predict where there's going to be a revolution? And it's like you can't. It's incredibly difficult to get those data.
Exactly.
So I don't know the answer to that question, and I wish I did, but I think it's a really, really interesting one, because if the only difference is orientation towards the status quo because of like political preferences, and the status quo becomes the politics you prefer, and you're an authoritarian, then suddenly you've shifted from left to right-wing authoritarianism. That seems really plausible. But if there's something that's like really important about the psychology of I want to overthrow things versus I want to protect things, then you wouldn't anticipate that shift.
Right.
And so it's a really important question. Yeah.
Well, so that's why I use the image of this Venn diagram where, there is some overlap, but not all of it. Because in the example of the Hungarian Revolution, you had ex-communists that I presume, and again, I can't say for sure, I presume would have supported maybe even the Russian Revolution, or even maybe the institution of communism in Hungary. But 8 years of communism, 8 years later of communism, they're like, okay, no, I can't get behind this. This isn't real communism. And you saw that all across the USSR and the Eastern Europe, where you have all these ex-communists or even current communists who were against the government because they didn't think it was sufficiently or even at all communist in nature. They were using communism as a kind of like a mask of sanity, or just like a cover. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you've got this. So that's one category, I'd say, of people who might be but the question then is, well, would those people even be considered right or left-wing authoritarians to begin with? Maybe not. Maybe they were just left-wing, like, can you be maybe some version of a revolutionary leftist that isn't like that revolutionary leftist, the kind that would go out in the streets and engage in political violence?
Yeah, and there's a lot of debate about this. I think people would fairly disagree with me in saying that left-wing authoritarians are always revolutionary. There are people who would argue there are currently left-wing authoritarians who don't want to overthrow the government necessarily. So there's different perspectives here. But I think that yes, you can have a revolutionary who's not authoritarian. It's kind of by the same token. And I the way to do that would be like within social democratic systems. I'm not a like trained philosopher or historian, so here's where we're getting out of my element, right? But in terms of people's personality and their psychology, I certainly think you can have revolutionary politics and not be an authoritarian.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we've got those people out of the way now. But now we've got someone like, Vladimir Lenin or Stalin, who were authoritarian leftists.
Yeah.
They were not only revolutionary but violently revolutionary, and like to an extreme degree, as you know, in the quote that you paraphrased, who then came to power and became the established authority, and then, of course, naturally, because they were now in power, supported that power, and for many years. So now you have. So I think you can say that without a doubt there is at least a subset of left-wing authoritarians that do kind of, just by definition of supporting the new status quo, do become right-wing in that sense. So
right.
the issue for me would be this is where I'd like to see future research go, is to tease that out further. You know, like you said, it's difficult, but that seems to me to be at least maybe a starting point for finding that that basic authoritarianism that's shared between both. And I think also we haven't talked about it yet, but the social dominance orientation, right? Well, maybe could you talk a bit about SDO, or social dominance, how that relates to right-wing authoritarianism, and then, you know, how that was significant for this study on left-wing authoritarianism?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think much of what you just said, I really very much agree with. But to chat about SDO, social dominance orientation. Yeah. So I spoke at the beginning of our talk about how authoritarianism had sort of changed in its conceptualization over time in psychology. So you had Adorno and Altmaier, and Altmaier narrowed it down by like cutting parts off of Adorno's conceptualization. And one of the parts he cut off was like the aggressive part, you know, the kicking down at people below you and like prejudice and that sort of thing. He really constrained it just to its submission to established authority and called that right-wing authoritarianism. And what social dominance orientation is that aggressive component. So it is the kicking down at people. And that didn't come, the construct, the term social dominance didn't come from Altmaier. It came from a Harvard psychologist, Jim Sidanius. But it maps on very well to authoritarian aggression. And Altmaier later argued that this was that second component of the authoritarian personality that was missing from RWA. And I think that's, and later John Duckett took that even further and really tested it and looked at that in all different ways and found pretty good evidence that that's the case. And so what I did in looking at LWA was, I didn't just want to focus on the submission component. I didn't just want to focus on right-wing authoritarianism. I wanted to look at both aggression and other aspects of authoritarianism in people with left-wing beliefs. And also, there was no reason at the time, nor is there now, to think that those two components are the only components of left-wing authoritarianism, right? Like we've only studied it for the most part, or predominantly studied it in people on the right. We've only studied right-wing authoritarians. So why should we expect left-wing authoritarians to have the same exact bits? And so we didn't want to limit ourselves by doing that. But what we found, really interestingly, I think, was that when you compared the profiles of our LWA construct in terms of their relations with all sorts of different things, like personality traits and thinking styles and motivations and beliefs and attitudes, like worldviews, that kind of stuff. When you compared that with RWA and SDO, you found this really clear pattern of similarities. And actually, there were different facets of LWA that mapped onto RWA versus SDO. So there was like one that looked a lot like RWA in terms of what personality traits it was correlated with. And then there was another one that looked a lot like SDO in terms of what personality traits it was correlated with. And that actually really strongly supports this idea that there's almost like a two-pronged, that authoritarianism has this aggression and submission component. The difference being that in LWA, the aggression is directed at the present hierarchy instead of at people who are trying to overthrow the present hierarchy. And same goes for right-wing authoritarianism. That was a lot of information and constructs and different things, but
well, because I remember back, it must have been back in 2006 or 2007, I read Altemeyer's book that he had on his website, The Authoritarians.
Mhm.
And so it's been a long time since I've read it, but so I remember him talking about what he called in the book, I think, social dominators. So how there were these two related concepts in right-wing authoritarianism. There's the authoritarian submission, which is the followers, and then there's the social dominators. And so if we come back to like the example of the Russian Revolution or a communist revolution like that, you've got, let's say, like left-wing revolutionaries, and you've got some of them, maybe not all of them, who are like high on that social they're prototypical social dominators, right? This is where you get a guy like Lenin or Stalin that comes in and they just fit the role. They do the job very well because that's what they're designed to do. But then you have this submission, like the authoritarian submission is more of a follower. It's like you're not taking well, maybe you can clear this up for me. When you're looking at authoritarian submission, is it if we take like an example of an individual, like let's say, maybe we can't because we need more individuals to capture all of this, but you've got an authoritarian and they will support a social, I'm getting confused in how I'm trying to phrase this. Basically, will a submissive authoritarian engage in like social dominance activities, like putting down people below them, or will they just support another person doing that, like the social dominator? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I see the way that Altemeyer wrote about this is a little bit different from the way that I think about it, and the way that it's thought about in like the Duckett's model that I mentioned. So it turns out that RWA, which is the submission component, and social dominance, which is the domination aggression component, are pretty highly correlated in most people, about 0.5 or so. And like, so for example, height and sex are correlated 0.4. So 0.5 is a pretty strong correlation. And that means that in the general population, you get both the submission and the aggression.
Yeah. Okay.
There is probably a different set of traits that go with being that leader, or like dominating authoritarian leader, but that turns out to be pretty hard to study because that's not as common, and it's also something that has maybe like fewer practical implications, because what gives these movements power is the people who submit. It's not the people at the top.
Okay, that reminds me of the kind of personality traits. So in several of these, you're looking in these various studies that you're doing of the phases of this this investigation. You're looking at a lot of personality traits associated with or correlated with either LWA or RWA, and then what they share and how they differ. And one of the things that stood out for me was, let's see, there's a few of them here. So this was when you kind of identified the three factors of LWA: the anti-hierarchical aggression, anti-conventionalism, and the top-down censorship, right? Okay. So in anti-hierarchical aggression, this seemed to capture the authoritarian dominance that you see like in when you're just looking at right-wing authoritarianism. So this is that SDO type thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to read this. In the personality domain, anti-hierarchical aggression was marked by low agreeableness, low honesty, humility, and low conscientiousness. Now, those are three of the Hexaco, traits, the big five plus honesty and humility, more or less. And what I found interesting about that is, well, first, not just this, but in some of the other parts of this study, you'll find correlations between, let's say, like right-wing authoritarianism and like high conscientiousness and low openness or something like that. And that seems like that's pretty much just a standard a standard correlation that you'd find just in conservatives, right? Because as far as I know, like conservatives are conscientious, not necessarily very open. Liberals are open and maybe not as conscientious and maybe more agreeable. I can't remember how strong all those correlations.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
So when you're looking at left-wing authoritarianism, you've got this low agreeableness, low honesty, humility, and low conscientiousness, which are also a pretty good description of like the psychopathic personality, at least the personality traits of the psychopathic personality. Because
yeah, sure.
Or did you want to have a comment on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that I am interested in psychopathy. I have published a little bit on it. My PhD advisor, who unfortunately passed away last year, Scott Lilienfeld, was one of the world's experts on psychopathy.
Yeah, I had a chance to meet him once, but
yeah, he is one of perhaps the most brilliant person I've ever met. He is a really incredible mind. Well, in any case, so yeah, psychopathy was something that you do see left-wing authoritarians look similar to highly psychopathic people, with some caveats. Like it's not exactly clear that like the mask part of the mask of sanity is there, like the boldness or fearless dominance is sometimes called, the kind of social persuasiveness and bravery and that kind of stuff. But in terms of like low agreeableness or antagonism and like even impulsivity, disinhibition, you did see that with authoritarians. And you also see that with high SDO people. So high SDO goes with low agreeableness, low honesty, humility. So there were some similarities there. I think your point though, that these personality profiles are also kind of confounded with those found typically in liberals or conservatives is a really good one though. I mean, that's a big problem with the RWA scale, that it is in no small part a measure of social conservatism.
Yeah.
So it's hard to disentangle, if we're studying like what are the personality traits of authoritarians, it's hard to disentangle that social conservatism and authoritarian, and we end up not knowing what the personality traits are. So that's why LWA is important, because we need to be able to say, oh, here are the commonalities across them. This is what we really need to drill down into to understand it.
And so one of the things that you find are the differences between the RWAs and the LWAs. So can you talk a bit about the distinct features of the LWAs? I think one of them is like the emotionality. So you don't find a lot of neuroticism in SDO and RWA, but you actually find neuroticism in the LWA, which again seems like it also could be confounded with the left-wing personality.
Yes, that's a good point. So we found that LWA was associated with neuroticism or negative emotionality. I think an RWA was not, or to a lesser extent. I think that one reason that that's important is because it's long been theorized that authoritarianism is a reaction to threat, and that people who are high on like trait fearfulness tend to be conservative and authoritarian, because they're trying to ensure that the world around them is orderly and secure and everything is predictable and safe. And so authoritarian systems of government and philosophies are one way of doing that. The problem is that neuroticism is in no small part about anxiety and fearfulness, about like the world around you and uncertainty. And it doesn't make sense that it wouldn't be correlated with authoritarianism, unless we're seeing this confound with ideology. I think that was a particularly important finding. And we did find that LWA predicted neuroticism over and above political ideology, controlling for ideology. That's one interesting avenue. There's more work to be done there, because again, I'm not sure the extent to which we can draw conclusions without having like a good measure of like general authoritarianism.
Okay. All right. Oh, Well, I was looking for something. Do you have something to ask Adam before I find my next question?
Well, okay. So just going off on that for a second, then, as you were kind of explaining that, I guess it seems to me from my understanding of kind of like the population at large, that you have people who are higher in trait neuroticism and such, that they do lean more to the liberal side of things. So that kind of makes sense. But then social conservatives or people who lean towards that side of the political spectrum seem to be lower in trait neuroticism. And if there is this theory or idea that authoritarianism is a reaction to fearfulness, that doesn't really make sense to me in that kind of a way, because these are people who aren't highly neurotic people. They're not desperately clinging in that kind of a way. So it seems to me that there's something else going on. It's not a fear thing, but it is. I don't know.
Yeah. What is it, Tom?
What is it?
Well, no, that's a great point. I think at least where that's coming from is conflating social conservatism with authoritarianism. Not you, but the measure, and people's conceptualization. I mean, I think those are very distinct things, even if they're correlated organically, which may be the case. They're distinct, and so wanting having like the low neuroticism and that sort of thing, low fearfulness, that may go with social conservatism, although I'm not saying that it does. But I think authoritarianism is just a different thing. And the reason we're finding these sort of like almost paradoxical patterns is because we're not cleanly separating those out as scientists just yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot more sense to me. And there was another point along that line, that just as far as, trying to, because like after reading your paper, and I think I said this earlier, I had to reevaluate what it is that I was actually talking about or thinking about, or maybe I was just talking about it to you, Harrison, before we started this conversation. I had to rethink what it was that I was looking at, what it is that we're trying to talk about. What is it that we're trying to describe? Because, like you were saying, so much of what we know as authoritarianism is defined by right-wing authoritarianism, because that was essentially what they were trying to do. They were trying to, I mean, like you said in your paper, they were trying to figure out why people were supporting Hitler and how he was able to come to power. And so they were looking at a very specific thing, but that's not what I think you are trying to look at and understand. And I don't think that's what we are trying to understand either. And that is what lies beneath it. And I think you kind of got into that and at a couple of points where you, like you said in your paper, we're pointing out like the factors that, both of these groups have these specific personality traits. And I think that's more along the lines of like where the essence of what at this point we're calling authoritarianism, but isn't necessarily like authoritarianism, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. I think that's exactly right, actually. Yeah, it's what we think of when we say authoritarianism is not necessarily what it is. And that's the big question is, what is it?
Exactly.
And if it's not this sort of right-wing social conservative mixed with like aggressions picture, what is it? I think it is a combination of personality traits, probably. There's elements of socialization in there too. I think what's interesting though is that it seems to interact with politics. You can't be an authoritarian without having like an avenue for that authoritarianism to manifest into. I suppose you could like be an authoritarian in your job, or like certainly, actually, there are probably some authoritarian academics, you know.
Yeah.
But you need like a venue for it, and so that's, I think, what makes it different than just personality. There's no place for it to be consistent across situations necessarily, as personality traits are, because there's really only one or two situations that people care about enough for them to be authoritarians in. And it's a kind of a new area in that way. Historically, it started out as a personality. People thought it was personality, then they moved, and it's social, it's motives, it's this, that. I suspect it's personality. I'm open to other opinions, but yeah, the question is, what is it, and how can we define it? And that's kind of the next step. That's what I'm doing now, is trying to figure out. Let's cut out left. Let's define what's unique about left and right, because that's important on its own, I think, as you've mentioned. But then let's see what's at the center of the Venn diagram, because that's what's like, if we want to like build an intervention to stop authoritarianism, that's what we would maybe want to target. And we need to know what it is.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that came to me was, I was wondering if certain aspects, so I'm not sure which ones, can be seen as a kind of, there's got to be a psychological, maybe an evolutionary psychological term for it, but basically a hijacked adaptive trait. So I think about something like sharing and empathy and trust, right? Where if you're in those tendencies and those actions, when they're enacted, can be not only personally but socially beneficial, right? When you engage in a trusting behavior and sharing and things like that. But you can have something like a psychopath who will then manipulate that in an artificial situation where the person is then, out of the goodness of their heart, supporting something that, or someone that, it turns out that it's a total lie, right? That they're just getting swindled. So that, I was thinking about that in terms of maybe authoritarian submission, where in any social group, maybe just for the good of the social group, if the system is relatively decent and is working, then it just seems natural to me that a lot of people, or a subset of the population, will just like almost automatically enforce it or submit to it. It's like because it works, right? So in a healthy society, you wouldn't see anything wrong with that. It would just be like, it would just be conservatism, right? Well, this works, let's keep it. It's like, I'm not bashing anyone over the head, but I'm just kind of, it works, and it works for a reason.
If we want to change things, let's do it incrementally and like make sure we're not messing things up.
Right. And so you've got these normal and probably healthy, given the right conditions, traits or behaviors or attitudes. And it's when something else gets mixed into it that it takes this kind of like, dark personality thing to it. And that's why, like, where I lean is the dark personality angle. And I don't know, like you mentioned dark personality and psychopathy and a few things in here. I'm not sure if the data yet supports such a strong linkage, but the way I see it, which may be wrong, is that's the kind of, that's probably getting closer to that underlying thing. I think it probably is more of a social dominance thing. It's when you have the SDO, when you have the dark personality enter the equation, then let's say you have corruption in your system, or in your society, which is not healthy, and which is causing problems. Well, then all of a sudden that pathologizes the natural submission that you would have to a good government just to make sure everything works. And it kind of legitimizes the opposition to that corruption, which I think Jonathan Haidt's work on like the moral taste buds would come into play. It's like you have someone that's like, no, that's not cool. But then in that revolutionary, in the revolutionary or in the leftist attitude, then you've got your own social dominators who are like, yeah, let's get rid of this system. Let's tear it down because I really want to be in that position. Right.
Yeah. Right. This is a chance to, that's really interesting. And the link between, I find that model very intriguing. I think the point you make about dark personality traits, psychopathy, psychopathic traits, whatever you want to call them, being almost like this hijacking. I think that comparison with authoritarianism is really nice, because one thing about a lot of personality disorder traits is that they are inherently interpersonal. They are something that exists in relation to other people, and so like you can't be a authoritarian on a desert island. You need other people to be an authoritarian.
But that would make a good comedy movie, actually. You know?
You're talking to yourself. No, you will not. You will obey my rules.
Right. And the trick with psychopathy is that it's an unusual pattern of correlations in the general population. So it's traits that don't always, or don't actually typically go together. So normally if you get someone who seems on their face very charming and nice and warm, or that you're drawn to them, that's someone, the heuristic you have is that, oh yeah, they're good and empathetic and nice, and I can trust them. Mm-hmm. It's a heuristic because those things are correlated in the general population, but in psychopaths, it's the opposite. So it's not even necessarily something they're doing intentionally. They're maybe not even trying to manipulate. It's just that they are not nice, and they are impulsive, and they will do what they want to. They'll do whatever they can to get what they want. And mm-hmm. So naturally, they're going to benefit from that, whether or not they're trying to manipulate you. People are going to trust them erroneously. And so I think, yeah, whether or not I think anyway, that sort of interpersonal dynamic could very well be playing out with authoritarianism or social dominance orientation in the way that you suggest. I think it could just be that. Yeah, I'm thinking through it as I say it. I guess the bottom line point is I think that there's a big personality component with authoritarianism, but that it's pretty much interpersonal. Yeah. Okay. I'd have to think through this more.
Because I was just, as you were talking about it, and this is something that I was thinking about earlier, kind of like how you had said earlier, Tom, that it's kind of hard to separate the authoritarianism from the political beliefs. Like it's deeply enmeshed, and the way that we have seen the authoritarian, I guess the authoritarianism going too far, in a lot of respects, like the anti or the revolutionary left-wing authoritarian becoming violent, or a right-wing authoritarian being violent, whatever it is, that is also kind of deeply tied to this, I guess, enmeshment with a psychopathological person who is manipulating in some way, shape, or form. I mean, maybe it shouldn't necessarily go there, but I'm thinking specifically like with the rioting that's been going on for the past year, 2 years more.
Yeah, like just a quick comment on that. This is probably, it's not representative of protesters. I wonder if it's representative of violent protesters, because I've seen a lot of like police reports after the fact where one of the violent protesters is arrested, and it turns out he's got a huge criminal record, maybe like sexual assault, violence and sexual assault against children, rape, and you see this all very often in actual protesters who have been arrested, and it makes me wonder sometimes when I'm looking at the police reports. Well, are they out there because they actually have the political belief, or for some of them, is it just an excuse to have a little fun, right, and destroy some stuff? It's like so maybe there's also an element of that in there.
So one thing that brings up for me is I think it kind of gets at the interpersonal impact or taking advantage of kind of point that you made. Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that like with any mass gathering, even like if there's violence there, the people who are misbehaving are the ones who, as a pattern, misbehave. So like the ones who are going to be arrested are going to be the ones with criminal records. Whereas like the people without, which could very well be like the vast majority of the protesters are not arrested. That being said, it doesn't mean that the people who were arrested thought, hey, why don't I just go out and I can take advantage of it. I mean, I don't know. But I think that like one interesting psychological thing here is just like the possibility that where there are problems in our society, like where there is conflict and trouble and this sort of thing, whether it's police violence or what, whatever else, there are people with maladaptive personality traits, maybe authoritarianism among them, that will be able to influence or like benefit from those traits in response to the disruption. And so I think that broader process, like it like using it as a way to characterize the protest, I don't know if that's fair, but I think it is like a really generally really interesting phenomenon.
And it's something that perhaps will be always a component. Like you said, whenever you have a mass gathering of people like that, you're going to get that type of personality that's there, and they're going to be the ones that get arrested, right? So, but that brings up a question for me. So part of this study was trying to predict participation in violent protests and in participation in violence, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what you have is, I think I'm going to go off memory here. Something like 13% or like 9 to 13% of the people you interviewed participated in a protest, and I think something like 1 to 2% of the people said they participated in some kind of like violent protest.
Yeah.
And then in a different part of that, there were something like 9% of the respondents expressed a willingness to engage in a violent protest. So I wonder I thought those were some interesting numbers. So basically when it came down to walking the walk, maybe like, and I'm probably reading too much because it's not representative,
small
but
numbers.
It's small numbers, but where my mind went with this was, okay, when it comes to walking to walk, maybe you've got 1 to 2% that will actually engage in something violent, but then you've got like 9 to 10% that say they will. It's like, oh yeah, I totally support that, right? But when it actually comes down to it, they probably won't. Like they'll chicken out and they'll realize, this maybe isn't really what I want to be doing. So maybe it's like it's kind of like an artifact or a mirage where you've got these people that say they're going to do it, but the people that actually maybe do engage in the actual violence are the types that we were talking about, that are the types that habitually engage in violence, right?
Right.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Now that you give out the numbers and everything, that totally makes sense to me in terms of the numbers breakdown, because I think it was like 2.3% of the numbers of the people in the study said that they had participated in violent actions. And then it was 91 point something percent said that they would not engage in violent actions even if given the opportunity, I think was what it was. And so if you have like that just makes sense that you would have the majority of people being, relatively normal and saying like, yeah, no, I don't think I would. And 2.3% of the population, well, that's pretty close to the, averages for like psychopathy and that kind of a thing, plus some who would actually become violent or would be violent in that kind of a way. So those numbers, I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't that far off from the general population, where you have like 9% of the people who say they would, just because, everybody likes to pretend like they're a badass until it comes to the moment, and then they're just total chickens.
Politics are part of your identity. Yeah. You want to morally signal, even if it's just to anonymous researchers. But
well, and to themselves too.
Yeah. Right. And to yourself. Yeah. But the barrier to actually participating in violence is very high. And what that means is that it's only the most extreme, like the people really at the far end of this trait spectrum that are actually going to, at a population level, engage in violence. And that's actually going to like increase the predictive strength of say like disinhibition for these sorts of things if you analyze it the right way. You see sort of an interesting thing actually. Like I don't know this. Like I'm one way to think of it is like psychopathic traits are more predictive of like sexual harassment and misconduct in women than they are in men. Well, why is that? Because there are a lot more barriers, like normative barriers for women to like sexually harass than there are for men. So it's only like the really psychopathic women who are doing it anyway. And I think you maybe see a similar thing with like participation in political violence. It's not, I don't know that it's psychopathy, but whatever trait it is that's influencing it, you could probably have to be pretty high on it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, how are you doing for time, Tom?
I think I do. I got to get going fairly soon.
Well, I think in that case, unless you had any more questions, Adam, I think we can probably wrap it up.
No, I think that pretty much covers the majority of it.
Okay. Well, it's been a blast talking to you, Tom.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thanks. We had a lot of fun. We like talking about this kind of stuff. So, but I'll be on the lookout for when you have new papers come out. Maybe I'll read some of your older ones too, and see if there's anything in there that I want to talk to you about sometime. But is there anything that you have in the works, right now? Like, do you have a next project that you're planning to work on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a few different things. One thing I'm working on is a big meta-analysis of the relationship between political ideology and thinking style. So meta-analysis, you aggregate all the different studies in the literature. And what we're finding there, just to give you a little preview, is that you get some notable differences between social and economic ideology. So psychologists have argued for a while that conservatives writ large are just more rigid. And that ties into like kind of pathologizing conservatives, and like authoritarianism fits into that whole syndrome. Like you're authoritarian, you're prejudiced, you're rigid, you're socially conservative, you're conservative. But what we're finding is this discrepancy between social and economic, where that effect does seem to hold true, albeit like with a smaller effect size than had previously been thought. But with economic, it's just not there. And I think that's an interesting thing. So that's the biggest project I'm working on. Us academics, we always have like a lot of irons in the fire, but I won't bore you with all the different ones.
All right. Well, thanks again, Tom. It was great talking to you. And
likewise. I had a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for your interest.
Cool. So once again, Tom's website is thcostello.com. In the show description, you can check out his papers. We'll have a link to this paper to the preprint version of it as well. So check that out. And everyone take care. And thanks again, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.